This is footage of a young man named Stephen McDaniel. Stephen is being interviewed in June of 2011 by a local news channel in Georgia's Macon County, all because his neighbor has gone missing. His neighbor was 27-year-old law student Lauren Giddings, who was only one test away from completing the state bar exam and fulfilling a lifelong dream. But just days before she was due to take the test, she seemed to simply drop off the face of the earth. A mild concern morphed into a full-on panic as the days dragged on with no sign of her. Her close friends knew that it was worryingly out of character for her not to check in with them. During the interview, Stephen is quoted as saying, "We're just trying to find out where she is at this point. I mean, no one has seen her since Saturday. The last time anyone had heard from her was an email she sent out, and no one's heard from her since." When asked if Lauren might have had any enemies, anyone who might have wanted to hurt her, Stephen replied, "No, she's as nice as can be, very personable, very much a people person. The only thing we can think of is that she went out running and someone snatched her. One of her friends has a key, so we went over, went inside, tried to see if there was anything amiss, but there was no sign that anyone broke in. We just don't know where she is." The woman interviewing Stephen then mentions that a body had been found in a nearby parking lot, provoking an almost catatonic reaction in him. He begins stuttering, turns a shade paler, then tells her, "I think I need to sit down," then walks away from the interview. Around 20 minutes later, the reporter for Crime Watch Daily Macon saw Stephen approaching her in an upset and panicked state. His interview then recommenced with a few short questions being thrown his way before the reporter finally asked him, "What's going through your mind right now?" Stephen breaks down in tears asking, "Why would anyone do this? If I had heard something, maybe I could have helped." Lauren's sister, Caitlin, later said that she never mentioned being in fear for her safety, although she had mentioned on one trip a year before when she came home, she felt things had been moved around. Someone had been in her apartment. By the time Lauren had been missing for 4 days, Stephen McDaniel joined in with the search for his missing friend. Caitlin Giddings got in touch with another of Lauren's friends after the group had gained access to her apartment, and it was around then that they made a deeply chilling discovery. Lauren's purse, keys, wallet, and school ID were still in the apartment. For Caitlin, the news had alarm bells ringing in her head, and she pleaded with Lauren's friends to contact local law enforcement to officially report her missing. Macon Police Sergeant Scott Chapman later said, "There were no witnesses. It was all just a matter of interviewing anybody who lived at that complex or anybody who associated with Lauren." During the course of their investigation, the police began to search the area surrounding Lauren and Stephen's apartments. Bibb County Sheriff Lieutenant Randy Gonzalez later said, "This is how we discovered the trash bag that was in one of the dumpsters. Once they were able to open the bag and look inside, we found her torso. There were no limbs attached and her head was missing as well, so all we had was a torso." The discovery of Lauren's dismembered torso made for an incredibly lucky break for investigators, as the dumpster had been due to be collected that morning. If it wasn't for the fact that the garbage truck was running late, they would have never found it at all. The discovery of the body was picked up by Crime Watch Daily Macon, who sent a reporter down to the scene to conduct interviews. This is how Stephen McDaniel ended up in front of TV cameras that morning, and when the footage was viewed by criminal investigators, they began to notice some frighteningly suspicious things about his behavior. Firstly, it looked as if Stephen hadn't slept properly in days. He looked pale, with deep dark circles under his eyes, and when he began to cry after hearing the news of the corpse's discovery, it was painfully obvious that no tears were actually being shed. Within just a few hours of the footage being aired, the police began to look into McDaniel's background. Friends described the 25-year-old law graduate as being quirky and intelligent, while others described him as being downright creepy. McDaniel had joint obsessions in firearms and zombies, and had often asked his fellow law graduates how they would go about committing the perfect murder. It was also discovered that McDaniel had once asked Lauren to go on a date with him, but she had refused, citing the fact that she was already in a relationship. Bibb County District Attorney David Cook later said that Stephen had both a master key and key to Lauren's apartment in his possession. He also had a flash drive that belonged to her that contained hundreds of her personal photos, along with a pair of her underwear. Her computer history showed an interest in her Facebook and LinkedIn pages, and sometimes he would be searching for images of her around the same time that he was looking up violent pornography. Investigators also found a deleted video taken from a video camera, one which appeared to show McDaniel's method of stalking Lauren. He had taken a wooden pole, duct taped the camera to it, then used it to peek inside one of Lauren's open windows. That was the straw which broke the camel's back, said DA David Cook. The video appeared to be from the same night she went missing. The police still couldn't prove that McDaniel had murdered Lauren, but they could prove that he had burglarized her apartment on a number of different occasions. He was arrested and charged for the incidents, and during the subsequent police interviews, he was put under increasing pressure to admit to Lauren's murder. It's during these interviews that McDaniel displays some incredibly disturbing behavior. He seems almost catatonic, sitting emotionlessly at the interview table while giving monosyllabic answers to the detective's questions. He stares blankly at the detective when asked, "Look at me while I'm talking to you." And it's honestly extremely disturbing how he seemed to go from a grieving, highly emotional person in his TV interview to a cold, unfeeling automaton when questioned by the police. When asked why he's shutting down, why he refuses to talk to the detective, Stephen replies, "I don't know," in a way that's so monotone and chilling that it's almost difficult to listen to. He's clearly going through some kind of mental breakdown, possibly resigned to the fact that he's going to be caught and convicted of murdering the innocent Lauren Giddings. It's worth noting that one of the police techniques used to intimidate a suspect into a confession is to stare directly into their eyes as a way of inducing introspective thoughts, making the suspect feel overanalyzed, almost as if though they're being read like a book. Yet McDaniel's stare is so intense, unfeeling, and terrifying that the detective who attempts this technique is actually the first to break the staring contest, obviously so unnerved by the suspect that he can't possibly continue the attempt. Over the coming weeks, detectives broke McDaniel down by employing what's known as the futility technique. They told Stephen over and over that they knew he'd murdered Lauren, and it was just a matter of time before they accrued enough evidence to be able to convict him. It took a long time to actually collect that evidence as it required numerous DNA tests, but in the end, it was enough to convince McDaniel to accept a plea deal. During his trial, Stephen openly recounted the sickening details of the murder in the courtroom, saying he entered Lauren's apartment at around 4:30 a.m. while wearing a mask, the same mask that police had showed they were in possession of. "She saw me and said very calmly, 'Get the hell out,'" he said. Then, I leaped across the bed onto her and grabbed her around the throat. In the struggle that ensued, Stephen confessed that Lauren had pulled the mask from his face before pleading with him to stop the attack. But it was far too late by that point. He was long past the edge of reason. In his mind, she had to die. No one could ever find out what a depraved, obsessive psychopath he really was. Once he'd strangled the life out of her, Stephen dragged Lauren's body into her bathtub, leaving it there while he planned her dismemberment. He then returned later that evening and cut her up using a hacksaw blade he'd purchased from a local hardware store. The cover of the blade was soaked with Lauren's DNA by the time it was later found in his apartment. He pled to breaking into Lauren's apartment, to strangling her, to moving her to the bathroom, to taking her body apart, to hiding it, to ripping up evidence and putting it down the toilet, Lauren's sister later said in a statement to the media. He cleaned up everything, then acted like he was still alive. It was all part of his plan. Only Lauren's torso was ever recovered, as Stephen had taken the time to dump her body parts all over Macon County as a way of covering his tracks. By the time he actually told the police exactly where they'd been deposited, they had long since been taken and disposed of by a number of different garbage trucks, meaning they had been dumped under piles of trash at a landfill somewhere, or incinerated at some kind of garbage disposal facility. Either way, there was no getting them back. Following his murder conviction on April 21st of 2012, McDaniel was given a life sentence, but will be considered eligible for parole in the year 2041. However, due to the nature of the crime as well as his serious personality disorders, it is highly unlikely that he will ever be released from prison. He is currently being held at Valdosta State Prison in Lowndes County, Georgia, a place we can all hope he remains for the rest of his natural life. Stephen showed on live television that he was capable of putting on a sick performance of grief, that he was desperate to divert suspicion from himself, having committed grotesque acts of murder and butchery. I think we can all agree that a person like that never deserves to see the light of day, ever again. This is footage from an edition of The Jenny Jones Show, taped on March 6th of 1995. The Jenny Jones Show was one of those Jerry Springer-style tabloid talk shows that became synonymous with the 90s. But after failing to take off with a more traditional Oprah-style format, the show's producers began to flaunt much more sensationalist content, including paternity tests, out-of-control teens, feuding neighbors, and in some cases, secret crushes. It was this final subject that became the topic of the March 6th taping, with guests being interviewed in front of the live studio audience before their secret admirer was revealed to them from backstage. Some reveals were more successful than others. Some couples were mutually attracted to each other, while other guests didn't find their attraction reciprocated. But in the case of Jonathan Schmitz, his secret admirer was perhaps the person he least expected. Jenny Jones began by feeding small, cryptic clues to Schmitz, in the hopes that he might be able to guess who his secret admirer might have been. Although Schmitz is visibly excited by the prospect, he fails to conjure up any idea of his admirer's identity, even when informed that they were someone he interacted with on an almost daily basis. When the time came to reveal his secret admirer, Schmitz seemed desperate to find out exactly who this person was. Yet the shock on his face is evident when the person's name was read out. You see, it wasn't a woman's name that Jenny Jones called out. It was a man's name. Jonathan's secret admirer was a man named Scott Bernard Amedure. As the audience whooped and cheered in surprise, 32-year-old Scott of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania walked out onto the stage to greet his secret crush. Schmitz couldn't have been more surprised, but at first, he seemed to take the revelation with good humor. When asked if he was single, Schmitz replied that he was, but that he was definitely heterosexual, meaning that there was no chance for him and Scott to get together. The audience also applauded when Schmitz returned Scott's embrace before he left the stage, as despite the fact that he had been very surprised by his appearance on the stage, he seemed to harbor no ill feeling towards his secret admirer. It was later reported that the crew of that day's show actually went out for drinks together following the end of the production, with Schmitz and Scott being spotted chatting and drinking together as the night went on. There were subsequently mixed rumors surrounding the events that followed the night out, with some claiming that the men went their separate ways, while others argued that a brief, intimate encounter had occurred. But either way, we know that 3 days later, Scott Amedure left a handwritten note on Jonathan Schmitz's door. The contents of this note have since been hotly disputed, but it's since been agreed by all parties that what was written was highly suggestive. After Schmitz found it, he got into his car, drove to a nearby bank, and withdrew a sizable amount of cash from his current account. He then drove over to Scott's mobile home to confirm that it was him that had left the note. We know that in response, all Scott did was give Schmitz a knowing grin, and at that, Schmitz told Scott to wait where he was, then returned to his car to fetch something. You see, before Jonathan Schmitz knocked on the door of Scott's mobile home, he stopped somewhere other than the bank. He'd also visited a local gun store and used the cash that he'd withdrawn to purchase a 12-gauge shotgun along with a box of shells. It's possible that Scott expected Schmitz to return to his mobile home with a bottle of wine, maybe another kind of gift, and that Schmitz had played the part of the nervous but curious prospective lover. Yet when he returned to his car, Scott saw the shotgun in his hand, but by then, it was far too late to run. Schmitz pumped 2 rounds of buckshot into Scott's chest, shredding his internal organs and killing him almost instantly. He then drove home, got out of his car, walked into his house, and called 911. The call to the dispatcher is freely available to listen to online, and it's chilling to hear how resigned Schmitz sounds as he confesses to the murder. "Ma'am, I think I just shot a man," he says, with just a hint of sadness in his voice. Then, as the dispatcher tells him to calm down, Schmitz breaks down crying as if the gravity of the situation had hit him for the very first time. The dispatcher kept Schmitz on the phone until officers could arrive to arrest him, and it's a testament to her composure that Schmitz gave himself up without harming himself first. At his trial, his defense attorney pointed out that Schmitz had been diagnosed with manic depression and Graves' disease, which had been known to cause extreme anxiety and irritability in those who suffer from it. His attorneys also used the so-called gay panic defense, which argues that an extreme homophobic reaction is to blame for the defendant's violent behavior, one that can be acquainted with a kind of temporary insanity. It made for a pathetically weak argument, and after being found guilty of second-degree murder, Schmitz was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in federal prison. 3 years after Schmitz was sentenced, Scott Amedure's family sued the Jenny Jones show for what they referred to as ambush tactics. The court case sparked a societal debate on the morality of tabloid talk shows, and the exploitative nature of such entertainment was on trial just as much as the Jenny Jones show was. The Amedure family's lawyer argued that the Jenny Jones show's format had directly resulted in the death of their loved one, and that they were almost banking on Schmitz having some kind of adverse reaction to his secret admirer being a gay man. The argument was so compelling that, in May of 1999, the jury announced that Warner Brothers were to pay the Amedure family a jaw-dropping $29 million in damages, which is the equivalent of around $50 million today. Court documents stated that the Jenny Jones show created an unpredictable situation without due concern for the possible consequences. However, the Michigan Court of Appeals later overturned it by a 2-1 decision, meaning the Amedures didn't see a penny of their proposed settlement, despite the intimate involvement of the Jenny Jones show. The questions that court case sparked are just as relevant today, in the age of reality television, when public exposure can prove to be just as much a burden as it is a boon. This short video shows YouTuber Trevor Heitmann showing off his month-old McLaren 650S supercar. 18-year-old Heitmann, who went by the username McSkillet, was arguably one of the first major examples of financial success within the world of streaming and online gaming. He also went by the moniker King of Skins, and he earned this nickname by designing and selling custom content, or skins, which changed the look of in-game characters in the first-person shoot-'em-up video game Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Heitmann also hosted a popular YouTube channel under his McSkillet username and posted videos detailing leaks of future CSGO content, game glitches, top 10 lists, and tutorials to help his fanbase get better at the game. His tens of thousands of skins sales, coupled with his YouTube following of almost 1 million subscribers, evidently made Trevor a very wealthy young man, as he was able to afford a car that some say was in the price range of around $700,000. But in May of 2018, his entire world came crashing down around him. One of the ways that McSkillet became so wealthy was with random skin giveaways. Many of these giveaways, especially around the holiday period, were completely free to enter and gave his followers a chance to win up to $10,000 worth of free CSGO skins. Although this couldn't strictly be described as gambling, McSkillet's operation drew the attention of Counter-Strike developers when they decided to crack down on so-called content gambling. Some have argued that this was a genuine attempt to stop people from making illicit revenue from their game, while others assert that they simply wanted to muscle the likes of McSkillet out of the pictures so they could rake in the additional profits themselves. Either way, the CSGO developers made the decision to confiscate $200,000 of Trevor's virtual skins before blocking his ability to buy or sell any others. Overnight, Trevor's virtual empire was burned to ashes, and it had a devastating psychological effect on him. He went from being one of the most influential figures in the entire online gaming community with a revenue stream that a Fortune 500 CEO would be proud of, to being just another gamer. At least, that's the way he saw it. He still had his YouTube channel, he still had an active social media following, and there's no doubt that he had tons of potential to make both money and maintain a public profile. Perhaps it was his young age and inexperience in life, and it's indisputable that the CSGO skin trading ban would have devastated his income. But to Trevor, the ban was nothing short of apocalyptic to him, and it caused him to spiral into a deep and debilitating depression. Not long after the skin trading ban, Trevor had gone out for a drive in his McLaren, and when he returned home, he made a shocking confession to his deeply concerned mother. He told her that he had driven his supercar at speeds of up to 150 miles per hour on the wrong side of the road in a residential area with a maximum speed limit of only 25 miles an hour. At first, Trevor's mother didn't seem to believe him, but when he insisted that he really had done something so reckless, she became apoplectic with rage. She screamed at him to never do anything so thoughtless or dangerous ever again. But when her fury didn't seem to have an effect on him, she tried another, more heartfelt approach. She begged her son not to put himself or anyone else at that kind of risk, morally compelling him to refrain from such behavior. "You can't do things like that," she reportedly told him. All he replied was, "Yes, I can." As soon as Trevor's father arrived home, his mother informed him of everything their son had told her. This new lecture included appeals to the law, with Trevor's father asking his son what he would do if the police ever caught him driving so recklessly. "The police can't hurt me," he said to have replied. "Neither can their bullets." Trevor's behavior grew worse and worse as he confessed to harboring increasingly dark thoughts regarding himself and the world around him. His parents pleaded with him to give it time, insisting that the skin trading ban was just a small hurdle in what promised a long and prosperous career. After all, they'd gone from telling him to stop spending so much time playing video games to being nothing short of stunned when he'd finally showed them his bank balance. They hadn't believed it was possible to make so much money from playing video games, let alone selling fake clothes, as they called them. But there it was. Their own son had made more money than they'd made in a lifetime, all in just a few short years. They told him all that, tried building him up, tried bolstering his confidence, but none of it seemed to work. Nothing seemed to drag him from the black cloud of depression that he had immersed himself in. Then, on the morning of August 23, 2018, Trevor's behavior seemed to hit a severe low point. His manic depression had begun to manifest itself in severe mood swings that his parents described as being erratic and irrational. They were so terrified that he might do something to harm himself or those around him that they contacted the local San Diego Police Department, begging them to subject Trevor to a psychiatric evaluation. Shockingly, despite everything they told him, the SDPD officer they spoke to told Trevor's parents that since he hadn't broken any laws, they would be legally hamstrung from performing any kind of psychiatric evaluation. It was up to Trevor's parents to keep him from harming himself, and after almost an hour of trying to reason with him, he broke down in tears and admitted that he was going through a kind of mental breakdown. He was exhausted, and for almost a week had barely slept for more than a few hours at a time. After weeping of his loss and his deteriorating mental state, Trevor finally felt as if he could finally get some proper sleep, then went back to bed to finally catch up on the sleep he'd missed. Yet the reprieve was only temporary, and just 4 hours later, Trevor was awake again, and his renewed energy was poured back into his devastating depression. The first Trevor's parents knew of their son being awake was when he walked into their driveway and attempted to climb into his McLaren. His mother begged him to come back inside, but Trevor refused, going so far as to physically lay hands on her when she grabbed him by the arm. Trevor's father acted quickly in climbing into his own vehicle before blocking his son's car into the driveway. But that didn't stop him. Trevor repeatedly rammed the rear of his McLaren into the side of his father's vehicle, with its powerful engine making short work of the impromptu blockade. Within just seconds, his car had enough room to back out of the driveway, and once it did, Trevor drove down the street at top speed and out of his parents' view. It was the last time they would ever see their son alive. A few minutes later, Trevor smashed through the gates of the nearby Ashley Falls Elementary School and almost plowed into two innocent people who tried to stop him. I was worried he was going to hit the two people standing at the gate, a bystander later said. They stood in the middle trying to stop him, doing hand motions, but he didn't stop at all. If they didn't move, they would have got run over. He didn't stop his car. He just kept accelerating and the gate busted open when he hit it. The same eyewitness later said that Trevor got out of the McLaren, walked over to the school while cursing and seething to himself, then smashed one of their windows. Following this bizarre outburst, he stomped back to his busted-up McLaren, climbed back into the driver's seat, then sped away as fast as he could. 20 minutes later, at around 4:30 p.m., Trevor had made his way onto Interstate Highway 805 and was driving at speeds of more than 100 miles an hour. The speeds he was traveling at made the situation extremely volatile, but there was another aspect of the incident that made it even more horrifying. Trevor was driving against the flow of traffic. He weaved in and out of cars for a few minutes, soundtracked by a chorus of honking horns as terrified drivers wondered what the hell he was thinking. But finally, Trevor just seemed to pick one, almost at random, and put his foot down as he aimed for one particular Hyundai SUV. Driving the vehicle was 43-year-old Aileen Pizarro, and in the passenger seat was her 12-year-old daughter, Ariana. It's hard to imagine the terror they must have experienced in their final few moments. Difficult to picture the horrific speeds at which Trevor's car flew at theirs. The impact was so violent that both vehicles immediately burst into flames, causing huge plumes of black smoke which swept over the highway. One motorist, Hector Puga, told a national news channel that he saw a vehicle swerve before it exploded. All I could do was hold onto my steering wheel and run over everything that exploded, he said. The only consolation is that they didn't suffer. All 3 people involved in the fatal crash were killed the instant it occurred. In the aftermath, the developers of Counter-Strike Global Offensive paid tribute to Trevor in a number of different ways. Firstly, Trevor's business logo appears as an Easter egg in Counter-Strike Operation Broken Fang in the bomb's defusal map, Engage, which was set in a car factory. Trevor's business logo also appears as the company's logo of the game's fictional automobile company, Mass Cars, and can be seen on the grille of all the cars in the map, as well as several of its walls. As you can imagine, this generated a huge amount of controversy, as some felt that it was in extremely bad taste to commemorate Trevor, akin to commemorating a firearm enthusiast mass shooter by naming a gun after them. Others commented that it was the developer's greed and ignorance that led to his nervous breakdown in the first place, as if though they'd simply allowed him to continue trading skins, he'd never have been pushed to such a horrific breaking point. Maybe the only thing we can all agree on is that society's capacity for dealing with mental health crises is severely lacking, and there is no better example to illustrate this than Trevor's breakdown. If he had only gotten the help he so desperately needed, at a time he needed it, then his is a tragedy that might never have happened at all. This is footage from a 1978 episode of the popular game show, The Dating Game. Typically, the way the dating game worked was that a bachelorette would question 3 bachelors, all of whom were hidden from her view. Then, at the end of the questioning period, she would choose one to accompany her on a date with expenses paid by the show. The show's host, Jim Lang, introduced the man on screen as a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the darkroom at the age of 13, fully developed. Between takes, you might find him skydiving or motorcycling. But the man in this video had another passion too. You see, his name is Rodney Alcala, and by the time he appeared on the dating game, he had already committed a series of brutal assaults and murders. Born in San Antonio, Texas, Rodney's single mother moved him and his two sisters to suburban Los Angeles when he was 11 years old. By 1961, a 17-year-old Rodney had joined the United States Army as a clerk, but in 1964, he suffered a complete nervous breakdown, going AWOL before hitchhiking from Fort Bragg to his mother's house. A military psychiatrist subsequently diagnosed him with an antisocial personality disorder, and he was discharged on medical grounds shortly afterward. Following his departure from the military, Rodney attended the UCLA School of Fine Arts. It was here that his life as a predatory criminal began, and on September 25th of 1968, a member of the public called 911 after spotting Rodney lure an 8-year-old girl into his Hollywood apartment. Thankfully, when the cops arrived, they found that the girl was still alive, but Rodney had severely beaten her with an iron after committing an obscene act of abuse and had already fled the scene. To avoid the arrest warrant put out for him, Rodney fled to New York City and enrolled in the NY Film School under the name John Berger. Following his graduation, he obtained a counseling job at a New Hampshire arts camp for children in 1971. Then in June of that same year, a 23-year-old flight attendant named Cornelia Crilly was found violated and strangled in her Manhattan apartment. The circumstances of her murder were shockingly similar to the assault on Rodney's first victim back in LA. So shortly after Cornelia's body was found, Rodney was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. Posters of Rodney's face were posted all over New York, and after 2 children attending the arts camp recognized him, they immediately informed the police that their suspect was none other than an instructor at their arts camp. The idea that such a dangerous man had secreted himself among dozens of potential victims caused horror and outrage among the general public, and the police rushed to apprehend Rodney before he could harm another child. As a result of their swift actions, he was arrested before being extradited to California, but by that point, the prosecution's case against him had weakened considerably. As a result of their family's trauma, the family of the 8-year-old girl he'd assaulted had moved down to Mexico to start their lives anew, and when contacted regarding the trial, they refused to let their traumatized daughter testify. And without such a valuable testimony, the California authorities were unable to charge Rodney with either assault or attempted murder, and were forced to go with the lesser charge of inappropriately touching a child, which, unbelievably, only carried a sentence of 3 years. After completing just 17 months of his sentence, Rodney was paroled, yet it took him just 2 months to be rearrested for the assault of a 13-year-old girl. Rodney had lured her into his car by promising her a ride to school, then had driven her to a secluded area before subjecting her to a horrendously venal attack. He was once again arrested, but despite demonstrating a compulsive desire to commit hideously obscene acts, he somehow ended up with an even shorter sentence of just 2 years. Following his release in 1977, the Los Angeles parole officer in charge of his case somehow allowed him to travel back to New York City. It's possible that Rodney had manipulated them into thinking that he had reformed himself, but it's also very likely that the LA parole board simply wanted him out of their hair. Either way, just a week after arriving in Manhattan, the body of 23-year-old Ellen Jane Hover was found buried under heavy rocks on a hillside overlooking the Hudson River. NYPD cold case investigators now believe that Rodney was the girl's murderer, and despite the public outcry and publicity the case received, Ellen so happened to be the goddaughter of Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. The case has remained officially unsolved for all these years. However, officially unsolved simply means that a conviction has never been handed out, and given how similar the murder was to Rodney's other killings, it doesn't take a genius to work out that he's the guilty party. Following the manhunt of Ellen's killer, Rodney fled back to California to avoid a repeated case of arrest and extradition, and by 1978 began working as a typesetter for the Los Angeles Times. Due to his history of violence, he was interviewed by members of the Hillside Strangler Task Force as part of their investigations of known offenders, and although Alcala was ruled out as the Hillside Strangler, he was arrested and served a brief sentence for a drug possession before once again being released. After getting out of prison for the third time, Rodney began a novel new approach to his predatory desires. He began posing as a fashion photographer, convincing hundreds of young men and women that he was a strict professional in order to trick them into posing for what he referred to as his portfolio. One of his LA Times coworkers later said that he very unprofessionally shared his photographs with workmates. "I thought it was weird, but I was young. I didn't know anything," she said under the conditions of anonymity, before adding, "When I asked why he took the photos, he said their moms asked him to. I remember the girls were naked." When reached for comment, one of Rodney's photographer subjects from 1979 commented that he said that he was a professional, so in my mind I was being a model for him. When the portfolio was later recovered by police, they discovered that it mostly included extremely explicit materials, and they feared that some of the subjects may constitute additional victims. Their suspicions were correct, as according to later trial testimony, Rodney had knocked unconscious a 15-year-old girl while she was posing for photographs before horrifically violating her. Just over a year after his appearance on the dating game, Rodney Alcala committed his final murder. On June 20th of 1979, 12-year-old Robin Samso disappeared while walking between Huntington Beach and her ballet class. After her rotting corpse was discovered almost 2 weeks later in the LA foothills, police officers rushed to question her close friends, only to discover that a strange man had approached them on the beach, asking to take their pictures. When a composite sketch of the stranger was circulated, Rodney's old parole officer recognized his likeness, and during a search of Rodney's mother's house near Monterey Park, police found a rental receipt for a storage locker all the way up in Seattle. When the locker was searched in turn, a chilling discovery was made. Robin Samso's earrings were in there, a grim trophy of Rodney's final unfortunate victim. Rodney's final arrest came in July of 1979, and the following year, he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for Samso's murder. Yet for some ungodly reason, his guilty verdict was overturned by the California Supreme Court, who cited that jurors had been improperly informed of his prior crimes. It took 6 more years before a second, almost identical trial saw Rodney sentenced to death for a second time. Rodney also endured a third murder trial as late as 2010, where he was charged with 5 separate counts of first-degree murder. This was perhaps the most bizarre of Rodney's public appearances, as he showed the jury a portion of his 1978 appearance on the dating game in an attempt to prove that the earrings found in his Seattle locker were his, not Robin Samso's, even though he wore no earrings during the show's taping. He seemed to repeatedly gloat over the fact that he'd been on television, and the inclusion of the evidence meant that a man named Jed Mills, the actor who competed against Alcala on the show, was forced to take the stand. Yet instead of confirming that Rodney had been wearing earrings, Jeb told a reporter that earrings were not yet a socially acceptable accessory for men in 1978, adding that, "I had never seen a man with earrings in his ear, and I feel like I would have noticed them on him." Despite his initial defense, Rodney made no significant attempt to dispute the 4 other charges, but seemed to cast an insult at the final 4 victims by claiming he couldn't even remember killing them. As part of his closing argument, he played the Arlo Guthrie song Alice's Restaurant, in which the subject of the song tells a psychiatrist that he wants to kill. It took less than 2 days' worth of deliberation for the jury to convict Rodney on all 5 counts of first-degree murder, and according to news reports, a surprise witness during the penalty phase of the trial was none other than Tali Shapiro, Alcala's first known victim whose family had relocated to Mexico following her brutal and traumatic assault. It seems she had spent years regretting the squandered opportunity for revenge and had wrestled between understanding her parents' intentions and resenting them. Following California's moratorium on the death penalty, Rodney's death sentence would be put on hold. Yet on July 24th of 2021, he would die of unspecified natural causes in Corcoran, California at the age of 77. That day marked the end of a man who had spent almost his entire adult life inflicting pain and misery on the vulnerable and defenseless. And although the reasons why he killed might be up for hot debate, what's certain is that he will most definitely not be missed. The following footage looks like it could come from just about anywhere in America. A young man in a hoodie heading into a gas station's convenience store to pick up a few groceries before heading home for the evening. But this footage is unlike any other because there's a horrifying backstory to how this young man ended up at this particular convenience store and how the company he's keeping is anything but cordial. You see, the young man's name is Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, and he's just committed one of the most heinous acts of mass murder in American history. On the afternoon of April 15, 2013, the 117th annual Boston Marathon was in full swing, with thousands of runners sweating and panning their way through the streets of one of the most famous cities on Earth. The winner crossed the finish line at around 11:50 a.m., with the runners-up not too far behind, and as the morning ticked over into the afternoon, scores of other amateur runners crossed the finish line in dribs and drabs, which was located outside of Marathon Sports at 671 to 673 Boylston Street. The afternoon was going well, with crowds of onlookers cheering on those that staggered across the finish line, gasping for water and grasping at the heat blankets handed out by Marathon staff. But then, at exactly 2:49 p.m., the mood of the day was torn asunder by the malicious evil of two shadowy young men. Two explosions ripped through the waiting crowds, sending whole people and torn-off body parts flying through the dusty air. The windows on adjacent buildings were blown out by the shockwave, sending a shower of wood and glass fragments over the wounded and dying. As the dust settled and the screams of the injured rose up into the skies, rescue workers and medical personnel rushed into action, joined by a plethora of volunteers who sought to provide any kind of care they could. The entire city's police, fire, and medical units were dispatched, including those from surrounding cities, as the armada of emergency vehicles were joined by private ambulances from all over the state. Then over the next few hours, it was determined that on top of the 3 people instantly killed by the explosions, an estimated 265 others had received wounds of varying severity. It took 27 different hospitals all over the state to be able to cater to such a horrifying mass casualty event, with at least 14 people requiring amputations. Emergency action plans were put into place all over the city, with the remaining marathon runners being diverted to Boston Common and Kenmore Square. A number of larger buildings in the immediate vicinity began evacuating personnel, fearing there might have been some kind of coordinated bomb attack. This fear was only compounded by the number of dropped bags and packages abandoned by their owners as they fled from the blasts, with many emergency personnel fearing that just about any of them could have contained additional explosive devices. Many false reports of such devices were received by panicked emergency services, and by pure happenstance, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library nearby Dorchester suffered a small electrical fire. This too was reported as a bomb attack, which sadly diverted valuable personnel and resources to a blaze that probably could have been dealt with by one man and a fire extinguisher. Fearing a 9/11-style joint operation, the airspace over the city of Boston was completely cut off to outside air traffic, while departures were halted from Logan International Airport. Cell traffic was congested to breaking point, forcing the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency to release public broadcasts urging people in the vicinity to use text messaging instead of voice calls due to how crowded the cell phone lines were. Some believe their inability to use their phones was the result of some kind of organized attempt to prevent cell phones from being used as detonators, but others found that they were able to place calls to affected friends or relatives with few problems at all. The subsequent lack of information available meant that the American Red Cross stepped in to help concerned friends and family receive information about runners and casualties. The Boston Police Department also set up a helpline to provide information on potential casualties. But perhaps one of the most heartwarming facts of that day was that, due to the closure of several hotels near the blast zone, a number of visitors were left with nowhere to stay. This led to many Boston residents opening their homes to complete strangers in order to provide shelter and comfort. Within hours of the bombing, a combined task force comprising of almost every three-letter agency the United States has convened to investigate the attack, as well as those who perpetrated it. It quickly became obvious that there had been absolutely nothing in the way of intelligence reports to suggest the bombing was due to occur, meaning that either the terrorist cell was extremely small or the bombing was the work of domestic extremists. Evidence from the blast site was collected relatively quickly and included pieces of metal, nails, ball bearings, black nylon pieces from a backpack, and remains of an electronic circuit board. It should also be noted that the blast was so powerful that the lid of a pressure cooker was found on a nearby rooftop, suggesting the device used was of the homemade pressure cooker variety. It also became evident that the bomb had used fireworks as the method of detonation, and although the authorities believed that this might be their key to catching the suspects, the first information on suspects would come from one of the bombing victims. Jeff Bauman, a member of the Finish Line crowd who lost both of his legs as a result of the attack, wrote a text message while still in the hospital that read, "Saw the guy. Looked right at me." He later gave a detailed description of two suspects who seemed to briskly walk away from the bomb site in the moments before detonation, and it was this description that led to the first images of the suspects being released to the public. 3 days after the bombing, at around 5:20 p.m., the FBI released images of two suspects carrying backpacks and asking for the public's help in identifying them. The FBI said this was in part to limit harm to people wrongly identified by news reports and on social media, as there could be a whole other horror story written about the witch hunt which took place on web forums such as Reddit and Facebook. The FBI also released a video of the suspects, which appeared to show them hanging around to observe the chaos which followed the explosions, before each of them walked away from the site of the blast. Although their names weren't released to the public yet, security services believe the two young men were brothers by the names of Dzhokhar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and by April 19th, the investigation revolved almost exclusively around them. The same day, the Tsarnaev's sister had her New Jersey apartment raided by the FBI, and it was quickly discovered that the brothers used bomb-making instructions found in Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine, which advised them to make the triggers from remote controls usually used to control RC toy cars. Aided by the CIA, the FBI put together profiles of everything they knew about the Tsarnaev brothers. It was discovered that Tamerlan was born in 1986 in the northern Caucasus, an area of Russia just south of Stalingrad at the time of his birth, while Dzhokhar was born in 1993 in Kyrgyzstan. The brothers self-identified as Chechen because of their father's ethnicity, but the FBI learned that neither of them had ever actually lived in Chechnya. After successfully receiving political asylum in the US in 2002, the Tsarnaev family settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with Tamerlan later attending Bunker Hill Community College. However, he would soon drop out with aspirations of joining the US Olympic boxing team, saying that unless his native Chechnya becomes independent, he would rather compete for the United States than for the Russians, who made his native land too dangerous a place to live. There seemed to be a brief time when it appeared as if Tamerlan was settling into his new life in the United States, and in 2010 he even married a US citizen named Catherine Russell. Yet after an arrest for assaulting his wife, Tamerlan began to explore the more extreme Salafi form of Islam. He used YouTube to watch lectures of the Salafi way of life, which argued that modern Muslims should seek to emulate their original forebears and should eschew the trappings of modern life. On the other hand, the younger Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was a student at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth with a major in marine biology and seemed to have very little interest in Islam, let alone its more radical iterations. His college friends described him as being just a regular teenager, one that was popular among his fellow students. He liked hip-hop, smoked marijuana, and preferred not to talk about politics with those close to him as he simply didn't find it interesting. One friend later said that he literally couldn't believe Dzhokhar had been involved in the bombing, that it was inconceivable. He was much more concerned with sports and a cheeseburger than with religion. The deciding factor in his involvement in the bombing seemed to be the influence of his older brother, who he greatly admired, and the influence of his mother, who was said to have instilled both her sons with a desire to commit religious violence. Once their photographs had been released to the public, the Tsarnaev brothers knew their anonymity had been shattered and that they were now the most wanted criminals in the entire United States. They became desperate, and just a few hours after the pictures were released, the Tsarnaev brothers ambushed and killed MIT police officer Sean A. Collier in a bid to steal his sidearm. However, because of its sophisticated security retention system, they could not pull the pistol from his holster. As their desperation mounted, the brothers then carjacked a Mercedes SUV in Alston, Brighton, with Tamerlan telling the owner that they were responsible for the bombing as well as for executing a police officer. The Tsarnaev brothers then forced the driver to use his ATM cards to obtain $800 in cash, then ordered him to drive to a gas station to fill up for a long ride to New York City, where they planned to set off more explosives. Yet while Dzhokhar went inside to purchase junk food, the driver escaped from the Mercedes and ran across the street to a competing mobile gas station, where he begged the clerk to call 911. This is the footage we're seeing in the innocent-looking video, a teenage boy who looks like he doesn't have a care in the world, when in reality, he's not only committed a horrific terrorist attack, but he's planning an even deadlier second one. Shortly after midnight on April 19th, Watertown police officer Joseph Reynolds identified the brothers in the hijacked vehicle, following it while he waited for additional units. When the high-risk traffic stop was undertaken on Laurel Street in Watertown, Tamerlan Tsarnaev stepped out of the Mercedes and immediately opened fire on two police officers. A terrifying firefight then ensued, with an estimated 300 rounds of ammunition being exchanged between the two warring parties, and at least one pressure cooker bomb and several homemade grenades were thrown by the Tsarnaev brothers. One of these improvised hand grenades wounded BPD officer Dennis Simmons so badly that he passed away a year later as a result of his devastating injuries. According to Watertown Police Chief Edward DeVoe, the brothers had a veritable arsenal of firearms, and it was only when Tamerlan ran out of ammunition that a police officer was able to tackle him to the ground. In the panic, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, who had been driving another stolen vehicle, attempted to flee the scene, and what he did next had been the subject of much debate. The fact remains that he essentially charged the officers with the vehicle, but in doing so, he ended up running over his own brother. Some believe that Dzhokhar had thought officers arresting Tamerlan were performing CPR on a wounded officer, and his charge was an attempt to run them over. But there are others who believe that Dzhokhar deliberately murdered his own brother in an attempt to slow down the investigation, believing that he would crack under the questioning and name Dzhokhar as his accomplice. Either way, the severely wounded 26-year-old was taken into custody, but died at the nearby Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center at around 1:35 a.m. Just a few minutes after critically wounding his own brother, Dzhokhar abandoned the car he was driving just a half-mile away from fleeing on foot. Given that he was on the run in a residential neighborhood, local residents received automated calls that pleaded with them to stay indoors. Officers in tactical gear then set about restricting access to a 20-block area of Watertown and used loudspeakers to tell residents not to leave their homes or answer the door. That evening, 2 hours after the shelter-in-place order had been lifted, a Watertown resident who lived just outside the search area noticed that the tarp was loose on the boat parked in his driveway. He approached, peered into the boat, then recoiled as he saw a bloodied Dzhokhar Tsarnaev lying in the hold. Within minutes, police officers had surrounded the boat, and when Tsarnaev attempted to emerge from it, the officers opened fire. Dzhokhar was arrested at exactly 8:42 p.m. with gunshot wounds to his head, neck, legs, and hand. Initial reports that the neck wound represented him attempting to take his own life were contradicted by him being unarmed at the time of his arrest. After his wounds were stabilized, Dzhokhar was questioned for almost 16 hours by investigators, and on April 22nd of 2013, a bedside hearing saw him charged with the use of a weapon of mass destruction and with malicious destruction of property resulting in death. Tsarnaev pleaded not guilty to 30 charges in his first public court appearance, and when his trial began on March 4th, he was described as a soldier in a holy war against Americans, whose goal was to reach paradise. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, emphasized the influence that his older brother had on him and painted Dzhokhar as a simple-minded follower. Just over a month later, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was found guilty on all 30 counts and was subsequently sentenced to death. And so he now resides on death row, awaiting the same fate he wanted to bring to so many innocent people that day. The same day he walked around in his basic black hoodie, looking just like any other 19-year-old in a society he had completely and violently rejected. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe you can hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. And click on that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.